Hello, everybody. Welcome to this USA Freshers event, which is being run by the Arts and Humanities Society, also known as LRAC. My name is Dr. Stuart Mitchell, and today I'm going to be talking about propaganda in Europe's 20th century. This is part one of a two-part lecture, and I've subtitled this The Bountiful Future. Hopefully that will make some more sense when we move into the presentation. Okay. So this is what I'm talking about. And I've defined propaganda there as information designed to support a particular cause or to damage an opposing cause. Now that's quite a big, baggy definition of propaganda, and it can include things that are really relatively benign and relatively innocuous, such as public information, films and booklets and that sort of thing. But in this particular case, I'm going to principally examine the types of propaganda that are produced by states, and even more specifically, the so-called totalitarian states that existed in the middle of the 20th century, in particular, the Nazi Germany and communist Russia. There will be a few other states mentioned and a few other regimes mentioned at the periphery here, but it's mostly going to be those two authoritarian states that I'm going to be looking at, and the propaganda that is produced by their governments. So I've narrowed that down a little bit, but I think this is what in the public mind is most associated with a kind of a propagandistic regime. And those types of propaganda, the types of propaganda produced by those states, have a number of different intentions. So the things that I've listed in the points below there, the propaganda that I'm going to be talking about has as its purpose, as its intention, at least one of those potential points. So it may be that the propaganda seeks to persuade people to support the goals of a particular state, in the case of this lecture, but it can of course be a party or a movement, or a campaign or something like that. So that's one of the principal aims of propaganda. It's necessity to persuade people, its citizenry, in the case of the regimes that I'm going to talk about, to support a particular goal, a particular aim, a particular intention of the regime, the state that produces it. It may be to legitimize a regime. Now, the states that I'm going to be talking about do not rule by terror alone. They need to be seen as legitimate authority in the eyes of their populaces, their citizenry. And so they go about legitimizing themselves in a number of different ways, and propaganda is one of the most important ways in which they try to legitimize their rule. And that's because to some extent they are concerned that they otherwise will be challenged in one way or another, either internally or externally, which I'll come to a little bit later in the lecture. These types of states also try to instill certain ideal behaviors in a population, that is, things that the regime approves of, actions that the regime deems kind of ideologically or maybe even morally correct. They're not always successful in that, but that is certainly the intention of a lot of the propaganda that they pump out. Now, that's actually going to be something that I will talk about rather more in the second part of this lecture, but do bear that in mind, because there will be things in this part of the lecture which kind of reflect that motivation as well. Likewise, the states in question try to demonize and ridicule their enemies. Now, I've said in brackets there that the enemies need not be not be real, rather. They can be confected, and quite often they are confected, not always. And the reason that sometimes enemies need to be confected or need to be made up or more usually exaggerated is because that creates greater bonding and integration in the populace that a regime has power over. This is generally called negative integration. So positive integration is where you get a group which has some kind of natural things in common. Now, that might be that they share a similar hobby, they might share similar political beliefs, they might live in a particular geographical area, they may have a common faith or something like that. Those are groups that have kind of obvious boundaries in some ways, and they are positively integrated in the sense that they have this thing in common, which is purely about the things that they share, which are internal to the group. But to create even tighter integration, and this is kind of often necessary for authoritarian regimes, it's vital to create a sense of threat from outside to that positively integrated in-group, and therefore an out-group of one kind or another is often created or exaggerated in order to create that sense of threat. The out-group wishes, for whatever reason, to destroy or in some way harm the members of the in-group. So creating that sense of a dangerous out-group, whether that out-group exists or whether it doesn't, is important for the regimes themselves in order to create that sense of negative integration. And those enemies can be both within a state, so they're potential threats to a particular regime, or they can be external. Now, the internal enemies are usually seen in times of relative peace, or usually portrayed in times of relative domestic peace. The external enemies tend to come into play more during times of war, but that's not a hard and fast division there. But this is one of the reasons why states of this nature, totalitarian states, non-democratic states, feel the need to create these enemies which were often kind of blown out of all proportion, caricatured, and made to seem a more pressing and immediate threat than objectively speaking they are. And you'll see that quite a lot, both in the propaganda examples I'm going to show you today, and even more so in the second part of this lecture, when I'm going to talk a bit more about the images that these regimes create. And then lastly, these parties, these regimes, wish to influence public opinion in other countries. And again, that's particularly at times of conflict. Those 5 motivations, that's not an exclusive list, you could add more in there, but those I think are probably the 5 most important. And they overlap, of course. These aren't kind of hermetically sealed aims of propaganda. There's a lot of symbiosis and overlap between those. And likewise, propaganda has a variety of different audiences as well. It's not always necessarily directed at one particular group. So it sometimes has to serve a multiplicity of aims, a multiplicity of different audiences that it needs to appeal to. And we'll look at that a little more in the slides to come. Okay. Now, in terms of how these regimes, the regimes I'm going to major on today, how they view the main, but not the only, audience for their propaganda, this is actually quite a neat encapsulation from Hitler in Mein Kampf. The receptive powers of the masses are very restrictive, and their understanding is feeble. On the other hand, they quickly forget. Such being the case, all effective propaganda must be confined to a few bare essentials, and those must be expressed as far as possible in stereotyped formulas. These slogans should be persistently repeated. Now, when you look at Nazi Germany, actually, in reality, and certainly as the regime becomes more established, the format of propaganda becomes really quite dramatically more sophisticated than what Hitler is at this point. Mein Kampf, of course, written in the 1920s, is advocating. So some of that sophistication, some of that nuance and the complexity of both the form of propaganda and the way in which it's delivered and the audiences to whom it's delivered, I'll be talking about as the presentation goes on. But nonetheless, this is the kind of the root. This is what propagandists believe at bottom is their view of the masses, their view of their idealized audience. In other words, they assume the receptive powers of the masses are very restrictive. Their understanding is poor. They are ignorant. They quickly forget. So, but what they found in practice, although that's their view of their audience, what they found in practice, propagandists of these regimes, and this goes just as well for Soviet Russia as well, their view of the masses as ignorant and in need of education is very similar to this. But in practice, as those regimes establish themselves in power, they find that very simple and constantly repetitive propaganda is actually not as effective as Hitler here is hoping that it will be. And so it has to become more nuanced, more sophisticated, and with a greater kind of variety, both of different mediums and types of presentation, types of imagery, types of argument, if you like, than they originally envisaged. And so propaganda actually becomes a very rich source of developments in not just blatant kind of demagoguery, but also in terms of the ways in which it is applied to different art forms, how it actually helps the development of different art forms, everything from kind of film to sculpture. And it becomes in itself a genuine art. So this is not to in any way suggest that propaganda is something that we should be looking at with an approving eye, but nonetheless, it does genuinely shift the boundaries of what is possible within art, within visual presentation, and in doing so, it kind of slips into or fits with some of the broader trends from outside of these regimes, across the whole of Western Europe and indeed across the Atlantic as well. So there's what you'll see here is also kind of refinements of art forms, as well as the more kind of sledgehammer type propaganda that this particular quote implies. I hope that makes some kind of sense. We'll see some some practical examples right now. Now, one of the things you don't see, except in wartime, in most liberal democratic regimes, is propaganda of the type that I'm mostly going to be talking about today. By which I mean, you don't find this kind of produced by the state itself. You don't find it produced by the governing party, the governing regime. And I mean, there is propaganda, but it's more along the lines of, obey the highway code, don't forget to get your vaccinations, that sort of thing. So it's more like public information. And where you do see propaganda of the type that I'm mostly going to be talking about, it's from bodies and organizations that are not kind of part of the central state. So you do see it, and you'll see the kind of tropes that are used in the propaganda that's produced by political parties and movements. And you've got 3 examples here, which are similar to, although generally speaking not as extreme and certainly not as ubiquitous as the types of thing that you will see, or I'm going to show you, from the 2 main totalitarian regimes that I'm going to be discussing in a moment. So you've got stuff like this. This is from a Conservative Party general election poster from 1929, relatively mild, but it does use some of the tropes which we'll see in a very heightened form in the Soviet and the Nazi cases in a while. This is a little bit more. This is a little more similar to the kind of egregious and sort of grotesque imagery that is found more often in the cases of the fascist and communist regimes. The Spartacus League was a kind of an offshoot of the KPD. That's the Communist Party of Germany. 1919 Germany. This is the beginning of the Weimar Republic, and the Spartacus League attempts a revolution, which ultimately fails. But you can see the kinds of imagery that is being used there, and we see that kind of repeated and elaborated on in the regimes themselves. And this is from the front page of a magazine that's produced by the Popular Front in France, which is a coalition of it's kind of left-leaning parties which gains power in the mid 1930s there. But all 3 of those pictures show the types of things that are being used by relatively straightforward political campaigns and movements, albeit kind of violent in the case of the Spartacus League. So what I'm going to show you next is what happens when those organizations and campaigns which sit outside, more or less, of the central state, what happens when they actually gain power and they have no rivals, or the rivals are kind of stripped away. It's an intensification of what you can see in those pieces of propaganda there. Okay, I hope that makes some kind of sense. Let's have a look at some of the key features of the 2 main regimes that I'm going to be talking about today. And one of the main features, of course, is the importance the overriding importance of a leader, and a leader who is explicitly non-democratic and in some ways sits above the political fray, who's on a pedestal and is imbued, rightly or more often wrongly, with certain qualities which sets that leader apart from the mass of everyday politics. So they float above, at least this is the image, they float above the regime and are given these, or portrayed as having certain qualities which are not common to everyday people, if you like. And it's that's essentially the root of what is sometimes called a cult of personality. That is a leader with some kind of sort of superhuman, in inverted commas, powers of one kind or another. This is a very common, very well known picture of Hitler. This is from 1938. This is a poster that was plastered all over Germany. There are lots and lots of posters that are very similar. If you just have a look on the internet, you'll find several of this nature. I've just chosen this one simply because it is one of the clearest images of the picture, the portrayal that Hitler wanted to project. So posters of this kind, as I say, pretty much ubiquitous throughout German society, posted up all over the place, and repeating a kind of a simplified mantra, which is supposed to set the leader apart from the sort of humdrum everyday business of political administration, if you like. Now that image of Hitler is kind of typical of what the regime wanted to develop, and it tries through a variety of different means. I'm going to show you one now, to develop this idea of Hitler being a kind of a constant presence in people's lives. And so you end up with this development of what you might want to call Hitler memorabilia, or Hitler tat, if you like. These are busts of Hitler. They come in a variety of different sizes. And from about 1934-35 onwards, they are available to buy for the ordinary German. Do buy yourself a bust of Hitler, put it on your mantelpiece to show your fidelity towards the great leader. So this busts are just one of the more common ways in which people can have Hitler's presence as a kind of a souvenir in their homes. So there are numerous other attempts to create some kind of decorative objects, if you can call them that, which feature Hitler in one way or another, and make a wonderful addition to the domestic German home. But the Nazis aren't the first to come up with this. In fact, it's the Soviet Union that develops this initially, and I'm going to come to that in a slide or two's time. But that's the important thing I want you to take away from this slide. It is the absolute centrality of the leader who sits above the everyday humdrum business of politics, and is kind of imbued with these almost kind of messianic features. Likewise, in the Soviet Union, this is actually from the Soviet Union. This is from East Germany, and this is a poster that celebrates Stalin's birthday in 1949. You can see that Stalin's features have kind of been softened there and made a little a bit more kind of handsome, noble figure than perhaps he was in real life. This incidentally is part of that process, or this purpose of this kind of poster, is to persuade people of the legitimacy of the regime. Then this is important, of course, in East Germany, because it's a relatively it's relatively recently that East Germany has fallen under communist control. And it's important for the Soviet regime to get the population's buy-in to the East German communist regime that they have erected there. So this is one of a number of different ways in which East German citizens are targeted in order to legitimate the communist regime that exists in East Germany. And again, here there's very explicitly the translation of the motto beneath Stalin's picture there very explicitly sets Stalin above the ordinary day-to-day of politics and life, if you like, and makes him into something of a guru, perhaps even. So he's the leader and teacher of humanity. He's almost got a sense of sainthood. If the communists have been at all interested in religion, and they definitely weren't, but this is perhaps what the kind of phrasing that you might use to describe somebody who had been beatified. He's the leader and the teacher of humanity in the fight for peace, democracy, and socialism. Whether or not any of those three things Stalin was committed to is open to considerable question, I would say. But nonetheless, there's an attempt there to make Stalin something, make someone who is apart from everyday life and is a great leader, almost in a kind of religious mold. Well, likewise, you have this kind of thing elsewhere. This is one of my few diversions into regimes other than the Nazis and the Soviet communists. And Mussolini's martial greatness is very important. Again, creating that image of the all-powerful, the omniscient ruler, and again to give that leader qualities which are superlative. Here it's Mussolini's great kind of martial spirit, his macho image, if you like, and this picture shows it's from the late 1930s. It shows his tremendous horsemanship, but of course, propaganda being what it is, this is somewhat misleading, because this picture has been extensively airbrushed, a very common technique for these dictatorships. So Soviet communism kind of led the way on airbrushing by removing entire individuals' lives from the historical record, or attempting to. This is not quite as dramatic as that in terms of what exactly has been removed from the picture, but it does give you a sense of the fragility, the underlying fragility of some of these strong men's self-image, because that there is the original picture, which is considerably less revealing of, or considerably more revealing about Mussolini's weaknesses, that he has to have somebody who is essentially controlling the horse while he's sitting astride it. Then I'll give you that as an example of the way in which those lofty images of the individual leader who is possessed of kind of special powers that are deliberately manipulated by regimes in order to kind of burnish their credentials, if you like. And that's Mussolini. And this is what I kind of tangentially referred to earlier on when I said that the Nazis were not the first to create an idea of Hitler memorabilia, the kind of souvenir type of goods and trinkets that feature their leader. It's the Soviet Union, particularly after the death of Lenin, that originates this idea of the kind of superhero leader who needs to be in one way or another memorialized constantly. So that's a picture on the left-hand side there, which commemorates the 5 years since Lenin's death, and it has I said earlier about the kind of the innovation that was involved in propaganda at this in these regimes, and that this is really quite a dramatically innovative form of photo montage there in the V representing obviously the Roman numeral 5, but also potentially victory. I'm not entirely sure. The photo montage that sits inside that is kind of visually quite striking, quite innovative for the time, and likewise the kind of the way in which the entire post has been created, as very sharp lines, these and the imposition of the triangles there. So it's visually very striking, and it's visually very innovative in artistic terms for this type of output. But it's quite but very soon after Lenin's death, this cult begins to be generated, and it creates a kind of a mini cottage industry, if you like, of things that to commemorate Lenin, to the extent that even Stalin has to periodically have some kind of reference to Lenin as the god of Bolshevism inserted into his own propaganda. So you saw the picture there, obviously, a couple of slides back of Stalin with the red flag and so forth. And sometimes he appears on his own. In fact, quite often he appears on his own. But periodically, he has to have things like this. So this is a poster from 1948, and the slogan reads, "Long live the Komsomol generation." Komsomol was the kind of youth wing of the Communist Party. So, and it's generally, very ideologically driven, quite a lot of youthful fervor in there, and kind of like sort of teenage shock troops of the revolution. Deeply unpleasant to those of us who have been brought up in democratic societies, I'm sure, but nonetheless a very important organization in terms of the perpetuation of communism in Russia. So this is to celebrate the Komsomol in the late 1940s. But even here, you got jolly old Uncle Joe looking relatively paternalistic there, and surrounded by a whole lot of young people representing the different walks of life of in the Soviet Union. But even there has to have this kind of like sort of like outsized bust of Lenin sitting behind him there, as a kind of a rubber stamp to say, you know, that Stalin is in the tradition of the original kind of Christ figure, if you like, of Soviet Bolshevism. And Christ-like figure is quite literally how Lenin was remembered in ordinary Russian homes, or was encouraged to be remembered and memorialized in ordinary Russian homes and various public buildings, especially schools, with the creation of Lenin corners. There we go. That's a young chap there setting up his Lenin corner. Obviously, this is a stage photograph, but nonetheless, it's quite a revealing about what at least the regime wanted its citizens to be doing. They're so very common in Russia prior to the revolution to have an icon corner or an icon shelf representing usually pictures of Jesus, the saints, and Mary, St. Mary, that's Jesus' mum. That's very common to have that in pre-Bolshevik homes and public places, little mini shrines, which are filled with very brightly coloured icons of one kind or another as a kind of an aid to worship, an aid to faith. This is just a Bolshevik version of that. These, of course, were never called shrines. The regime frowned on them being called shrines, but that's essentially what they were. And instead, they were called Lenin corners. And they were designed, or at least the idea was that they would replace the kind of icon shelves or the icon shrines that were far more common prior to the takeover of the Bolsheviks. So that's encouraged by the regime there. So this isn't unique or indeed original to the Nazi regime. The hero worship of a kind of a saint-like figure or even a Christ-like figure is well underway in Bolshevik Russia in the by the end of the 1920s. There's another example there of a family setting up their Lenin, again staged, but setting up their Lenin corner there. Got to get that picture of Lenin up there so that he can look down with his great bountiful goodness upon their whatever starvation rations they're subsisting on. So, as I say, this is something that's really important to regimes, is creating that cult of a leader and perpetuating that and making it kind of ubiquitous in society. And that leader needs to be able to take decisions which are uncommonly good, uncommonly better informed, uncommonly wise beyond what ordinary folk or even ordinary politicians would be able to come up with, for want of a better term. Okay. Now, the next thing to look at is some of the ways in which those regimes get buy-in, not simply to a particular individual, a particular leader, but to their rule in general. And so this next section is going to look at their attempts to portray the harmony of their regime, and also the way in which those states seek to present and gloss their achievements too. So here we have on the left-hand side a picture celebrating the May Day celebrations in Nazi Germany in 1936, and remember that these regimes are not democratic, and so they have to create or they feel as if they ought to create a sense of unity and a sense of harmony that kind of like overrides or supersedes the liberal version of social peace, social harmony, through a unity which is kind of not connected to the sort of democratic norms. Here you've got the representative of industry on the left-hand side and of agriculture on the right, united in their efforts to bring about harmony in the Nazi regime, and it also kind of represents the achievements as well of the regime in the pictures that are behind the two figures, the success of industry, the bounty of agricultural progress. So it's a very idealized image, of course, but nonetheless, that's the kind of picture that these regimes wanted to project to their populace. Likewise, on the other side of the page, there you've got this is from 1932. This is Soviet Russia, and the achievements of the regime. This is so important for these non-democratic regimes, because there aren't the kind of mechanisms by which legitimacy is conferred through elections and petitions and public debate. So those kinds of things are at best attenuated, and at worst are kind of just completely stripped away. So there must be other ways in which these states get buy-in from their citizens to their goals, which is what I mentioned at the very beginning. I hear one of the goals is kind of rebuilding. This is a peculiarly modern looking backdrop to the chap. This is also interesting that frequently you see the characters who appear in these posters all kind of very square jawed, kind of clean cut individuals, idealized versions of Soviet man or Nazi man in the case of Germany. And I'll be talking a bit more about the images of that kind in the second part of this lecture, when that comes around. But they're always looking out off into the distance, off to a horizon of the great utopian future, which is supposed to indicate hope for the future. But the achievements of the regime here are represented in this peculiar modernist looking housing development, I assume, behind the behind the chap's head, and these very landscaped public gardens as well. So this is an indication of the achievements of the regime, that it will bring about civilized life through the application of productive work. So achievements are important. It's not simply based, or the propaganda that is pumped out by these regimes is not simply based, indeed not even mainly based, on terrorizing their population. They need to get buy-in for positive things, positive modern, in inverted commas, achievements. And here's another couple of examples, and again, very modern in the way in which these things are portrayed, very at the technological cutting edge. This is very important for the Soviet regime. It's somewhat important to the Nazis too, but there is a difference there in the sense that the Nazis have kind of an ambiguous relationship with modernity, and that they quite like, or they are very prepared to trumpet their success in sort of technological developments, but they're also somewhat they have a wary view of modernity as kind of taking away from this their idealized view of old German ways of life, so that they're a bit conflicted about that in a way that the Soviet Union is not. But nonetheless, both regimes do use their success in rolling out and developing new technologies, more new types of construction uh, as badges of their um, their achievements, as an attempt to legitimize themselves in the eyes of their citizenry. On the left hand side there, you've got the announcement of the Moscow metro, and again you see that those very clean, stark lines of modernist design in that poster. Um, and again, this is a kind of idealized version of what the metro was like, but it is it was a quite considerable construction achievement, and decorated in a way, and presented in a way that was supposed to inspire awe in the people who used it on a daily basis. And on the right hand side of the slide there, you see the kind of the use of a simple visual image there, stylized visual image, to represent the achievements of the Nazi automobile industry. The Führer promised to motorize Germany, and look what he's managed to achieve. So good use of good use, effective, I suppose, better way of saying it, effective use of rendering statistics in a graphical form, which is more kind of easily digestible to the masses there, and at the same time gives a very clear indication of the supposed successes of the regime in securing this technological advance. You get this too, and again, because this is about making sure that the populace is on board with the goals of a regime, making sure the populace supports those aims, and also that in turn helps to legitimate the government, in at least ostensibly, at least. This is from Poland. Reconstruction in communist Poland is 1954, and of course, those, as I said earlier on about East Germany, those Eastern European countries that kind of fell under the Soviet yoke, having been devastated by years of war or Nazi occupation. It was important, although those regimes were horribly brutal, at least in the first decade after the Second World War. It was nonetheless important for those regimes to have a level of legitimacy in the eyes of the population, to ensure their continued rule. They're by no means secure, even as late as the mid 1950s, and it's a fairly big uprising in Germany. East Germany, that is, the year before. So there is a sense there in which communist regimes under the tutelage of the Soviet Union need to trumpet their achievements. This is another remarkable piece of graphic design for the time. Schleppy, it translates as blind, not sleepy. The images you can see through the dark glasses there, that's the ruined, decayed, or perhaps war devastated old housing stock, which is all you see if you refuse to take your blinkers off, or in this case your dark glasses off. in other words, willfully blind, whereas in fact, what is happening, or so the regime wants you to believe, is that there's this massive reconstruction. Again, those buildings look very modern. Industry is vaunted there in the way in which the image is portrayed. So this is an attempt kind of to point the finger at those Polish citizens who refuse to see or to acknowledge the supposed successes of the Communist Party in its reconstruction efforts. And I talked about technology, and I talked about how the technology could kind of be intertwined with the goals of a regime, as well as and helping to make it legitimate in the eyes of its citizens. This is the German People's Radio Receiver. All Germany hears the Führer on that. This is a cheap receiver that was mass produced in the mid 1930s, and it was so cheap that it kind of became ubiquitous. So it was a great opportunity for the regime to have this kind of mouthpiece in not only in public areas, but in the ordinary confines of the domestic home. This is an indication of how the regime sold something that was clearly as beneficial to itself, as a marvelous piece of technological achievement, which it was in a sense. Likewise, we have things like this. This is in the 1960s in Russia, where TV is being shown as a great bounty of communism. You may not be able to see the translation of the slogan underneath there, but it says, "The brilliant light of science proves that there is no God." So television here is presented as this great kind of technological breakthrough, which is accessible to the ordinary Soviet citizen. Wasn't, in fact, because it was really incredibly expensive. Most Soviet citizens didn't have a telly, certainly in the 1960s. But nonetheless, that doesn't stop them kind of promoting this sort of great technological advance here, and also demonstrating. You remember I said earlier on about the icon shelf, the icon corner that many Russian homes had prior to the revolution. Well, they weren't all swept away suddenly by the Bolshevik Revolution, much as they would have liked to have done that. And they weren't all replaced by Lenin corners. Some of them kind of like held on into the post-Second World War period. The picture above is, I guess, this lady's mother, perhaps, pointing to the icons on the shelf. But technology has made all that kind of ridiculous backward-looking faith supposedly redundant, and so the younger woman there is tossing away the icons and swapping them for this great technological boon which has been provided by the Communist Party, the television set. And of course the television set is also showing the Soviets muscle flexing, I suppose, and success in the space race there. Of course, this is before the Americans caught up. So again, these are some of the achievements of the regime, and it's kind of, these are the consumer sweeties that are offered to the populace as a way of getting their buy-in to the regime's goals and intentions. Another example here is from Hungary in 1968, advertising the Olympics. You can travel to by your TV to Mexico. No need to leave Hungary. That would you might see how the other half live. And again, really quite innovative graphic design for the time. So Kai is those two designers, Ava Kemeny and Laszlo Sos. And they produce an awful lot of posters in and various other kinds of media as well in Hungary in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Most of which is of this kind of funky post-war modernist type, with nods to things like pop art and so forth from the other side of the Atlantic. Another one from Sokai here. One wonders actually if these are quite common in Hungary in the 1960s. There's a real effort on the part of the Hungarian regime, the Hungarian Communist Party, to be very self-consciously modern, and to show the great benefits of Soviet-inspired consumerism as opposed to Western-inspired consumerism. We have all the material benefits that you have in the West, but we've also got communism. I wonder to what extent that that's particularly prevalent in Hungary because of the horrible aftermath of the Hungarian uprising in 1956, in which the Soviets came in and basically killed a lot of people. So there may have been a kind of like an overcompensation post 1956 there. But again, look, you can say give presents. We've got presents here. You don't have to live in the West to have nice presents. None of these have any brands or anything like that on them, and they all look a bit perhaps to the 21st century a little bit like kind of mantle shelf coffee table tut, but nonetheless at the time seen as rivaling anything that the nasty old West can provide there. And likewise, you have this is a still from a newsreel in the Soviet Union, newsreel there, at least very smartly dressed and incredibly sort of fashionable ladies and gents arriving for this particular conference. Unfortunately, the Soviet Union kind of has a habit of sort of self-sabotaging itself in a way that so we can't quite mimic Western culture, because the title of the newsreel is so obviously sort of bureaucratically, grindingly Soviet that it kind of belies the images there. You can get this, by the way. There's a you can see the whole newsreel on a site called 17 Moments in Soviet Communism. But you can see by the title of the newsreel there how this is kind of undermines itself as well. The Permanent Working Group for Issues of Clothing Culture of the Countries of the Mutual Economic Council meets in Sokolniki Park of Culture and Rest in Moscow. So you can't get that kind of hectoring bureaucrat tone away from the from what is otherwise a kind of a nice piece of propaganda, showing that the Soviet Union is the equal of the West in terms of its achievements in modern culture and fashion, just as much as in making railways and ships and that kind of more traditional heavy industry stuff. Okay, now finally I'm going to show you an excerpt from a rather nice little propaganda short from the Soviet Union called Victorious Destination. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but this I think will give you will show some of the things that I've already been talking about, some of the imagery I've already been talking about, and the idealism and the attempts at legitimation of a regime and the to get citizens' acceptance of the goals of the regime. This is kind of nicely kind of encapsulated in a cinematic form here. So hopefully you'll enjoy this little sliver of Victoria's Destination from 1934.
Пятилетка — это утопия! 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 Not утопия! Мы это все предвидели! Провал! Red! Провал! Крах! Провал!
Okay, so I hope you can see there some of the themes that I've been talking about. That's it kind of demonstrates exactly what I was referring to earlier. This is so there's the achievements of the regime that are being set up there. The goals of the regime have been, or at least some of them have been achieved. There's electrification, there's hydroelectric power, there's the growth of industry, there's the collectivization of agriculture and the kind of the sweeping away of the old ways of doing things, which of course is opposed by the enemies of the regime. And you'll notice the difference in imagery there, which I'm going to talk about a lot more in the second part of this lecture, when I refer to the kind of idealized symbolism of individual men and women as and their collectivities versus enemies. You can see that in the way in which that film is relayed. So you've got uh, the plutocrats all sitting around a table. This is presumably Western capitalists all smoking cigars and so forth. They're portrayed in a grotesque way, and even their voices are made unnaturally kind of higher and shrill, and less, in inverted commas, manly than the contrast, which is the Soviet worker, or the Soviet workers that you see in the picture, who are all kind of like featureless, but they all have this uh, kind of idealized, well-built body when they all comport themselves in a more in a sort of a functional way than the grotesques who inhabit that, or who are portrayed in the early part of that film as um, the Western plutocrats who are kind of wish to see the Soviet Union fail. So there's quite a nice, quite an interesting contrast there between the idealized Soviet worker and the decadence of the supposed Western fat cats, if you like. The other enemy, who's portrayed in that film, is the kulak at the end. The kulak again is portrayed as ugly and grotesque and standing in the way of progress, and eventually gets buried. Literally, in fact, but of course the film isn't keen to show the more brutal side, but it is very strongly implied nonetheless by the fact that the kulak individual, the kulak character, gets buried under the soil from the mechanized plow at the end, and the use of the term liquidated in the caption is also a bit of a hint of the way in which the Soviet Union dealt with its supposed enemies. There, a lot of this stuff, particularly about the imagery of human beings, and vis-a-vis modernity and vis-a-vis machines, and in respect of regimes, potential rivals or enemies, I'm going to explore in a lot more depth in the second part of this lecture. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that, and I hope that you'll tune in for part 2 of this lecture. This is who we are, the Arts and Humanities Society. It used to be called the LRAC. That's where you can find the society on the web, and that's me, Dr. Stuart Mitchell, and that's my personal little hobby horse, which is a series of lectures that I run in my hometown and also online. I hope you enjoyed listening, and I hope you'll tune in for part 2 when that arrives. Thanks very much.